Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about cycles. And this includes the water, carbon, and nitrogen cycles. So, here are some important terms that I think you should know about before we get started. A sink is a place where um, carbon can be stored. It can end up there, and it can stay there for certain periods of time. It can be long term or short term, depending on the store. But a sink is a good word to know. Another one is pump. A pump is a physical or biological factor that moves carbon through a cycle. And so a sink brings it in and stores it, and a pump pushes it out or releases it and keeps it moving through the carbon cycle. Other two words that I think you probably already know is biotic, which is a living thing in an environment or something that was once living, like a tree once was living, but now a piece of wood is still biotic because it was once living. Abiotic, non-living, like water, it's something that is not alive, or fire, it's something that is not alive. Okay. So we're going to start with one that you're probably pretty familiar with, and that is the water cycle. And you learned about the water cycle probably in middle school, and you learned about the shuns: evaporation, condensation, precipitation, infiltration, and those words associated with that. And you're probably pretty familiar with it. But it's a really important cycle. And something to note is that when water moves through its cycle, it is always H2O. There are no chemical transformations. It is always the chemical H2O as it moves through the cycle. Only state changes is what is occurring. So when it's in the ocean, it's H2O as water, as a liquid. And then in the air, it's a water vapor, and so it is a gas, but it is still H2O. And then if it's an ice, it's a solid, but it is still H2O. Something that fuels the water cycle is the sun. It is fueled by the sun. If there were no humans, plants, animals, anything on the earth, the cycle would still run because it's not a biotic cycle, but an abiotic cycle. The next cycle that I think you might have touched on a little bit, but it might be new to you, is the carbon cycle. So this is a really important cycle, and I want to watch a quick video just kind of introducing you to the cycle before we talk through it. And so I'm going to switch over and share this tab, and we're going to watch a brief video.
Or CO2, is the main greenhouse gas in climate change. So how does CO2 get into our atmosphere? Well, carbon is part of a cycle. It starts with the sun, which hits the Earth's surface with more energy in 1 hour than the whole world uses in a year. Plants, which are kind of like biological chefs, take that sunlight and then suck in some CO2 from the air, mix them together, and bam, they create a stored form of energy in the form of carbohydrates, such as glucose and sucrose. The process is called photosynthesis. When animals like us eat those plants, our stomachs convert that food back into energy for our own growth. Greenhouse gases are a byproduct of this process and are released through waste. If those plants die, they decompose, and tiny microorganisms break down those carbohydrates and again release greenhouse gases as a byproduct. As you see, energy originates from the sun and is then transferred as it moves through the food chain. But sometimes, carbon-based organisms, like plants or animals, get stuck in the earth. When this happens, they're compressed under tons of pressure and turned into carbon-based fossil fuels like oil, coal, or natural gas. Since the Industrial Revolution, humans have been pulling those fossil fuels out of the ground and burning them, activating the stored energy to make electricity and power engines. But the thing is, it also releases millions of years worth of stored CO2 back into the air. In addition, humans breathe in oxygen and breathe out CO2, but plants do the opposite. Trees suck up huge amounts of CO2, which balances the cycle. Thus, deforestation reduces the plants that store CO2. We're attacking the cycle from both sides. Think of it like a computer. A computer can operate a few programs at a time, right? Normally, when you finish with the document, you save and you close it, so as not to overwork the computer. Then imagine you stopped closing your documents, so they were all open at once. Your computer wouldn't be able to process it all. It would start to slow down and then to freeze, and eventually it would crash, which might be where our environment is heading if we keep overloading the.
So let's talk about the carbon cycle. So it starts in the atmosphere as CO2, or we'll start there. It doesn't actually start there because it's a cycle, but we'll start there. It starts as CO2, and then it's taken in by plants through photosynthesis. So it takes it in with light, like the video was talking about, and it converts it to glucose, or C6H12O6, which you'll learn about more when we talk about photosynthesis. And glucose is basically sugar. It converts that into sugars so that the plant can consume it. And so instead of being CO2, it's C6H12O6. So this is a chemical change. So unlike water, it changes chemically and goes into the organisms. But then as other animals eat it, or it decays, it goes back into the atmosphere as CO2, because during respiration by animals, they breathe out CO2 when they consume and break things down inside their bodies. Another way that it gets released is combustion. And that's by factories or by cars, or things like that. So it pushes it back into the atmosphere. A chemical change. Combustion is a chemical change back into CO2. And there are a lot of ways that, a couple other ways that CO2 is taken out of the atmosphere but not pushed back in by things, and that's by two ways that it's taken in. So by photosynthesis, and the ocean actually uptakes it, and it goes into the soils as well. But if things are decayed and it goes into the soil, it can be compacted down, like the video was talking about. So there are 7 billion people, plus all the animals and factories in the world. That's a lot of carbon pumping back into the world. Fixation is another word that you should probably know about. And so carbon is a non-usable form until it's converted by the plants and made into a usable form, that glucose, and that's called fixation. That process is called fixation. So 2 pumps to know about that are biological pumps are animals and plants. So they both can pump CO2 back into the air. While plants do absorb CO2, they also can contribute to some of the CO2 going back into the atmosphere via respiration, but not nearly as much as they take in. So that's animals and plants. A couple of other types of pumps are combustion, which we talked about before. And then also volcanic activity, which releases a lot of carbon all at once, but it doesn't accumulate like it does with combustion. And then the last is death and decay. So carbon sinks is another thing to think about. It was one of the important terms we talked about. So carbon can be stored in a few different ways. So mainly it's stored in the ocean. It can also be stored in forests or algae. and it can be stored in fossil fuels in the soil, or fossil fuels are compressed down over time, but they originally were in the soil. So it can also be stored in the ocean through sediments, and it can be stored in living things. So we are carbon sinks. We hold on to carbon, but carbon doesn't live very long in the matter of the world in us, because we die and it goes back into the system in 80 to 100 years, if that. So notice the faucet on the right side. So I wanted to show you this because it's a great way to think about a carbon sink. So we're cranking on that faucet as high as we can. And you all know if you crank on a faucet super high, the water doesn't drain out as fast as it goes in. And so it suddenly starts to overflow. And that is what's starting to happen in our environment, in our biosphere is we are pumping too much CO2 into the environment by burning fossil fuels and combustion and things like that, and we're melting the ice caps way too fast, and carbon is being released back into the atmosphere, and our sink is overflowing, and we're starting to push the limits on the amount of carbon that can be handled in our atmosphere. And the nitrogen cycle is more complicated, but it's a really important cycle to understand because we need nitrogen to live. Our DNA, our proteins in our body all have nitrogen in them. And so we need a way to get nitrogen from the atmosphere into our bodies to be used. So 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen, and it is in the atmosphere as N2 gas. And so it falls to the earth as rain or snow, or in rain or snow, and then bacteria fixes it into ammonia. So it basically breaks the N bonds and adds hydrogen to it. And that becomes NH4, as you can see here. So then other bacteria, nitrifying bacteria, will twice add oxygen to it. So it goes from ammonia to nitrites, and then it goes to nitrates. Okay, and then it can either be denitrified by bacteria and go back to the atmosphere, or by assimilation can go into plants and then into animals. Okay, and then eventually those animals or plants die, and they are broken down into ammonium and then can be used again and nitrified again, and the cycle continues. Instead of it being fixed here and made into ammonia by the bacteria, it can be fixed by lightning. So instead of it coming down from the atmosphere into the soil, bacteria change it into ammonia. It can be in one step, boom, zapped by lightning and made into a way that we can use it. And this is a really important cycle because it is moved by biotics, not by abiotics. It also is a very important cycle because, like I said, we need it for our DNA and we need it for proteins.